Among the most shocking events of 1968 was the assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King in Memphis 50 years ago this coming Wednesday. Dr. King's legacy has a very personal meaning for former New Orleans mayor and current Urban League president, Marc Morial.
Because I have a dream. My 4 little children will one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. I have a dream today.
This is the Martin Luther King most of us know. But I'm here to tell you about a different Martin King, who in the early 1950s at Boston University befriended my mother, Sybil Heidel Morial.
Martin was very popular. He had a wonderful, warm, outgoing personality. But he had something that not many people had during that time had. He had a car.
He had a car. He had some wheels.
So whenever he asked for a date, everyone said yes.
Mm-hmm. He didn't ask you out, did he?
He didn't ask me out, no. But he was Martin to me, and he was Martin until he died.
After graduate school, Mom moved back home to New Orleans, where she and my father, Dutch Morial, were both active in the civil rights movement. Dad would get elected to the Louisiana State House and eventually become the first black mayor of New Orleans. Growing up, my parents made sure my siblings and I knew all about Dr. King.
The marchers fell under clubs and whips.
We felt this is the reality. This is what we are. We are fighting for this, and you are part of this fight as our children. We felt strongly that we wanted you to be steeped in what was happening in this country.
By the late 1960s, Dr. King's message was evolving beyond race, evolving with new ideas.
Now, one of the answers, it seems to me, is a guaranteed annual income, a guaranteed minimum income for all people and for all families of our country.
Then, an even bigger step. He broke with President Johnson and some of his closest advisors, condemning the war in Vietnam.
If we continue, there will be no doubt in my mind and in the mind of the world that we have no honorable intentions in Vietnam.
I would have been about 8, and I think this was the last family picture that we took.
Martin Luther King III remembers his father's declining public support because of his campaigns against both Vietnam and poverty.
In many cases, he was hated and despised by 1968. I remember distinctly him coming up the stairs at our home and being exhausted.
He also felt that it was probably the most dangerous moment in his life because nothing he had done up until then really troubled the system.
We know Harry Belafonte as a music legend. You may not recall that he was a friend, confidant, and longtime supporter of Dr. King. Did Martin Luther King fear for his life?
Dr. King, he developed a tic. He would all of a sudden go into these hiccups. And then I noticed sometime after the first discussion of what the problem was, he had gotten rid of it. And I said to him, what happened? How'd you get rid of it? And he said, I've made my peace with death. He said, I'm no longer distracted by it. If death was to be the price, he was quite open to paying that.
Leading the march, the Reverend Martin Luther King, who flew in this morning.
That price was exacted in the spring of 1968 in Memphis. Dr. King had joined sanitation workers striking for better wages and working conditions. It's here he delivered his final prophetic sermon.
We've got some difficult days ahead, but it really doesn't matter with me now because I've been to the mountaintop. And I've seen the promised land. I may not get there with you, but I want you to know tonight that we as a people will get to the promised land.
Good evening. Dr. Martin Luther King, the apostle of nonviolence in the civil rights movement, has been shot to death in Memphis, Tennessee.
It was early evening, April 4th, 1968. Martin Luther King Jr. took that fateful step onto the balcony of the Lorraine Motel.
I was heartbroken that his voice had been silenced, that his voice that could corral thousands of people to use nonviolence, to not be afraid, to step out. His voice was shut down.
Were you angry?
I was angry, and I was sad.
Five days later, he was laid to rest in Atlanta. He was just 39.
What did you think at the time the effect of losing Martin Luther King would be on the civil rights movement?
I said that very thing to your father. I said, oh, we've lost our leader. What's going to become of the civil rights movement? He's gone. And I said, it will go on. He said it very deliberately.
And it has gone on. From Black Lives Matter to last weekend's March for Our Lives. We see it in elected office, in boardrooms, as well as in my work at the National Urban League. Still, I refuse to call April 4th an anniversary. It was an American tragedy, a tragedy that we are still coming to terms with 50 years later. Like a good, obedient son, I leave the last word to my mother.
When I think of from whence we came, kidnapped from Africa and brought to this country, and enslaved for a couple of centuries, and then moving on to become citizens, equal citizens through the laws, yes, I'm optimistic, but I know that we have to struggle. I know that we can't let up our efforts.